Welcome to Finding the Way Forward Through Racial Justice in Action. Today's webinar will be recorded and available for viewing at a later date. By joining this session, you are giving consent to be part of a recorded session. At the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A option available. Please feel free to post a question at any time during the webinar, and it will be sent to the meeting host. We hope to answer as many of your questions as possible today. Please note that participants' cameras and microphones will be disabled throughout the webinar, and the chat feature will not be available. Thank you for joining us. We'll begin in just a moment.
Good evening. It is so good to have so many of you here. In fact, over 600 people have registered for this event. My name is Mari Castañeda, Dean of Commonwealth Honors College and professor in the Department of Communication. It is my pleasure to welcome you here tonight at UMass Amherst alumni event. Tonight's panel, Finding the Way Forward Through Racial Justice in Action, brings together an esteemed group of faculty and alumni speakers who will be discussing how we find the way forward in this moment of intense political debate and social movement mobilizations, as well as utilize the principles of racial justice to understand historical moments and enact actions for a better tomorrow. As we know, the questions regarding social justice, equity, and belonging are enduring issues that were made all the more amplified last summer during Black Lives Matter protest, with the current COVID pandemic that has brought to bear these health inequities across the nation, and the ongoing racism that animated the shocking siege at the US Capitol a few weeks ago. So how do we make sense of these realities, and how can we find a way forward through racial justice in action? This is what tonight's discussion will be about. Before introducing our panelists, I want to thank my fellow deans for helping develop this event and bringing our wonderful speakers together. Mil gracias to Barbara Krauthammer, Dean of the College of Humanities and Fine Arts, Cynthia Gerstle-Pippin, Dean of the College of Education, and John Hurd, Dean of the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences. They and the other deans are amazing colleagues, and I am honored to be part of such a strong group of visionary leaders. I also want to thank all our colleges, development teams, and alumni relations for all their wonderful support of this event. So now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our moderator and panelists, who are truly the heart and soul of this event. Their full bios are available on the event website so you can see the amazing work that they've done. Our moderator tonight is Kathleen Brown Perez. She is a faculty member in Commonwealth Honors College, and it has an appointment in anthropology and is also a practicing federal Indian law attorney. A citizen of the Brothertown Indian Nation in Wisconsin, her research and publications focus on federal Indian policy and law. She is also the co-convener of a $2.5 million four-year grant awarded by the Mellon Foundation to the 5-college Native American and Indigenous Studies program that will enhance teaching, learning, and scholarship in the field. Our first speaker will be Dr. Jamila Liscott, an assistant professor of social justice education and founding co-director of the Center of Racial Justice and Youth Engaged Research at UMass Amherst College of Education. She is also co-editor-in-chief of the highly regarded journal, Equity and Excellence in Education. She combines scholarship and activism to explore, assert, and defend the value of Black life and disrupt racial inequities and enact a vision-driven justice. Her community-engaged research centers on racial equity, youth activism, and the power of hip-hop and spoken word in education. Dr. Treyandra Russworm is an associate professor of English at UMass Amherst with research and teaching specializations in a number of underrepresented minority students earning STEM-related degrees. Together with his wife, Marian Graddick-Weir, he co-founded the Massenburg Summer STEM Institute at UMass to help high school students from underrepresented groups explore STEM. Thank you once again to our brilliant and wonderful panelists for your willingness to engage in this important conversation tonight, and to all of you joining us. We hope that you enjoy the panel. Thank you. And now I'll turn it over to Kathleen.
Thank you so much, Madi. Good evening, everyone. I'm so happy that you decided to join us on this very well, at least here in the Amherst area. It's a very snowy Wednesday evening and a little cold. Hopefully you're someplace a little warmer. I would like to begin by acknowledging that the University of Massachusetts Amherst is located on the traditional lands of the Nonotuck tribe. Let's recognize the original inhabitants of this land, as well as their cultures, sovereignties, homelands. UMass Amherst is a land grant institution. MIT is the other land grant institution in Massachusetts. Abraham Lincoln signed the first Morrill Act to fund educational institutions by granting federal land to the states for them to sell, raise funds, and establish their college. Ironically, American Indians and Alaska Natives attend post-secondary education at a rate of just 17% in comparison with 60% among the total US population. I'm proud of the fact that UMass Amherst is a land grant institution, but I'm sure that you can all see the mixed feelings American Indians might have toward Abraham Lincoln. On September 22nd, 1862, he signed the Emancipation Proclamation. 3 months later, he ordered the execution of 38 Dakota Sioux for their participation in the Sioux Uprising, also known as people fighting for their land that was being stolen. This happened not far from where my mother was born and raised, on the Lower Sioux Reservation in Minnesota many decades later. On a brighter note, President Biden announced the Clean Energy and Innovation today. Many things are included in this innovation, such as strengthening land grant universities, historically Black colleges and universities, and other minority serving institutions for research and development and workforce development. Colonization and its negative impacts are a global phenomenon, but I want to specifically acknowledge the 800 plus tribal nations that exist within the external boundaries of the United States. 574 of these tribes have a nation-to-nation relationship with the federal government. There are 326 Indian reservations. Today, about half of all American Indians live on a reservation where life expectancy is around the age of 50. We hear a lot about the top 1% in our country. Many of those on Indian reservations are in the bottom 1%, literally. We are also just 1% of the US population. In a country where land ownership can be a road to wealth accumulation, Indians on reservations are left out. In keeping with the unique status of American Indians, reservations are federal land. Reservations actually take up only about 2% of the land in the US currently. Crime rates are high in Indian country, what many of us call the res. This is due in part to the fact that unless Congress says otherwise, criminal jurisdiction in Indian country is left to the feds. Many of the non-Indians who commit crimes on reservations are not arrested, investigated, indicted, prosecuted, or punished. It can also be an effective place to hide. Some of the more famous names of non-Indians on reservations in the past include Al Capone, Babyface Nelson, John Dillinger, Sam Giancana, and Jimmy Hoffa. Because of the jurisdictional rules, an American Indian indicted for a capital crime on a reservation can get the death penalty regardless of the laws of the state in which he is currently. Indian reservations have the highest unemployment and poverty rates in the United States. On the Blackfoot Reservation in Montana, the unemployment rate was 70% before the pandemic. During the worst of the Great Depression, unemployment in mainstream America was 25%. The annual income for 20% of families on reservations is less than $5,000. American Indians suffer disproportionately in many areas: infant mortality, suicide, children committing suicide, substance abuse, sudden infant death syndrome, diabetes, COVID-19 infection and death, domestic abuse, poor education, housing, crime victimization, particularly for American Indian women, who are 5 times more likely to be sexually assaulted than a non-Indian woman. There is also a near epidemic problem with missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada, the US, and Mexico, cases that often go uninvestigated, unprosecuted, unsolved, and unpunished, the victims unfound. In addition to acknowledging that we're all on Indigenous land, I also want to acknowledge that UMass is located in a town now called Amherst, named for Jeff Amherst, a man who committed biological warfare against Indigenous peoples. In July 1763, during Pontiac's War, he sent a letter to Colonel Henry Bouquet in which he stated, "Could it not be contrived to send the smallpox among the disaffected tribes of Indians? We must on this occasion use every stratagem to our power to reduce them." Bouquet responded that he would try this by means of smallpox-infested blankets and a hanky from Fort Pitt, which had recently had an outbreak of smallpox, taking care to not get the disease himself. He also expressed the opinion that it would be far better to do this than risk good men in a battle against the Indians. Shortly after the infested items were distributed, there was an eruption of smallpox among Delaware and Shawnee Indians. I also want to acknowledge today that today is Holocaust Remembrance Day. On this date in 1945, Red Army soldiers from the 322nd Rifle Division liberated Auschwitz-Birkenau. In the previous 5 years, 1.1 million people, mostly Jewish, were murdered at Auschwitz. Nazi Germany and its collaborators murdered 6 million Jewish people, 2/3 of the Jewish population of Europe. After World War I, 1914 to 1918, many Germans did not believe their country had actually lost the war. They blamed Jews and communists for orchestrating Germany's surrender. This fueled anti-Semitism. The Nazis' extermination program was carried out in the name of eugenics, racial purification, and white supremacy, none of which was unique to Germany. In 1896, Connecticut enacted laws banning people with epilepsy and who were feeble-minded to marry. In 1903, the American Breeders Association was created to study eugenics. John Kellogg, of Kellogg cereal fame, established a pedigree registry. There was also a eugenics record office on Long Island that tracked families and their genetic traits, claiming immigrants, minorities, and poor people were unfit. The office asserted there is clear evidence that negative family traits were caused by bad genes, not racism, economics, or social views of the time. In 1927, the US Supreme Court held that forced sterilization of the handicapped did not violate the Constitution. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes said, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. Thousands were sterilized before SCOTUS overturned this holding in 1942. Yet, according to the Government Accountability Office, between 1970 and 1976, although we know it happened for probably a decade before and a decade after, Indian Health Services sterilized between 25 and 50% of all American Indians. None of these sterilizations were done with informed consent. Some were done while Indian girls as young as 10 were under general anesthesia to have their wisdom teeth pulled. Some Indian women were told they could later have a womb transplant if they wanted children. American scientists and others who advocated for eugenics were getting attention from Germans who saw the eugenics movement as justifying their deeply held beliefs about inferior people. In 1924, a disgruntled corporal in the German army was serving time for inciting mob action. While there, he read books written by American eugenicists. He wrote the authors fan letters calling one of their books his Bible and expressing his satisfaction with those who extolled the Nordic race and bemoaned its corruption by Jews, African Americans, Slavs, and others who didn't have blonde hair and blue eyes. And he began writing Mein Kampf. The disgruntled corporal was released from prison and rose through the ranks of the German political scene. He spoke with comrades about laws in several US states, he spoke with comrades about laws in several US states that prevented reproduction by people whose progeny would be of no value and would be injurious to the racial stock. Hitler's experience with a battlefield gas injury in World War I fueled his idea that, quote, Hebrew corruptors of the people should have been gassed at the beginning of World War I to save the lives of real Germans who were valuable for the future. On January 30th, 1933, Hitler seized power. American eugenicists openly supported his eugenics program for the first 10 years of the Third Reich, envious of Hitler's ability to rapidly sterilize hundreds of thousands of non-Aryans from German society. In 1934, one American supporter complained to a local newspaper that the Germans are beating us at our own game as Germany's sterilizations were exceeding 5,000 per month. How do I address racism as it relates to American Indians? It's an interesting thing, and it's an interesting word choice for American Indians, because according to the Supreme Court, actually a Supreme Court decision, Morton versus Mancari, 1974, American Indian is not a race. This decision came from a case in which some non-Indians who worked within the Bureau of Indian Affairs were upset that there was an Indian hiring preference. And so the court decided that it made sense to rule that American Indians not a race, it's a political classification, because we are also citizens of our own Indian nations. The interesting thing about that, while it seemed to favor American Indians, there really is no such thing as a U.S. Supreme Court decision that really does favor Indians. Somewhere in there, when you read between the lines, it is really just about supporting the American government and its ideals about the people in this country. So what happened as a result of Morton versus Mancari is that it's very, very difficult for an American Indian to file any sort of a suit or a claim that is based on racial discrimination. How can it be racial discrimination when you are merely a citizen of your tribe? It's interesting because Morton versus Mancari, 1974, as I already mentioned, came exactly 50 years after the Indian Citizenship Act was passed. It surprises many people to find that not all American Indians were citizens until less than 100 years ago. But the interesting thing about it is that in 1924, if you know anything about income tax, that citizenship status came as a result of needing to collect income tax from American Indians, which would not have been possible had they not been citizens. So that was the real basis behind that decision. So there are a lot of Supreme Court decisions that impact American Indians. And I really just have a minute left, so I'm going to very briefly explain 3 of these decisions. They're known as the Marshall Trilogy, and they came out of the Supreme Court between the years of 1823 and 1832. And the reason that I'm going to explain this and even end with this is because really everything about federal Indian law comes from these 3 cases. They are the basis of federal Indian law and policy. And even Ruth Bader Ginsburg, although she later expressed regret for it, used these cases as a basis for a decision that was came down against the Indian tribe that was the plaintiff in the case. But the Marshall Trilogy, 1823, there was a case, Johnson versus Macintosh. We had 2 plaintiffs who determined that they had each purchased the same piece of land in the state of Illinois. One had purchased the land from the Pinkashaw Indian tribe. The other had purchased it from the US government. And so they needed a Supreme Court decision, apparently, to determine who actually had rightful title to that land. The court determined that the rightful owner was the person who had purchased it from the US government, because Indians do not have actual fee simple title in land. They have only beneficial use of that land, and that's what is now known as reservation land. Beneficial use, but not actual title. And that's interesting in a country where a lot of people who are not born wealthy actually accumulate their wealth as a result of property ownership. 8 years later, Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, the Supreme Court determined that Indians are to the United States government like a ward to its guardian. And so American Indians still have this ward to guardian relationship with the US government, which means that Congress has plenary power over what Indians can say and do, a little too much power, actually. And finally, the following year, Worcester v. Georgia, 1832, laid out the relationship between tribes and the state and federal governments, stating that the federal government was the sole authority to deal with Indian nations, that state law has no force in Indian country. I always tell my students, That's why we have Indian casinos, which is basically what it comes down to. But these three cases are extremely important, and again, support the fact that American Indians are in a very, very different position. It doesn't mean we aren't discriminated against based on our citizenship status, or for some, what they look like, but it does put us in a very, very different position. Okay, with that, I want to move on to our next panelist. Jamila is here. Let me fix my screen. Not quite as organized as I should be. Okay, Jamila, thank you so much for being here, and welcome, welcome. I'm going to ask you a question that will hopefully serve to sort of introduce your topic and fuel what you want to say. What is the work that needs to happen to hold educational institutions accountable for racial inequity?
Thank you so much. Thank you for your comments and this space. I want to begin by just sharing my screen here. And in beginning to answer that question, I want us to kind of bring us face to face with the social moment that we're existing in right now. Someone referenced the the insurrection that happened at the Capitol just a few weeks ago, and across media outlets, this was present on some. This news was not present on many, and I just want us to be very, very clear about this conversation about finding the way forward when we're talking about racism, equity, and justice. Like, be very clear about the socio-political reality that we're embedded in. This image, this symbol of hate, particularly for me as a Black woman, understanding the racial terror and the harm and the psychological violence that this symbol is meant to evoke. It's disgusting. There's no other words for it. It's disgusting to me that no one was held accountable. This is a hate crime. And for many people, I put the date on this picture because I want us to be very clear about when this noose was erected, and no one was held accountable for it being there. And I'm starting there because as we have conversations about racial justice and racial equity and anti-racism and finding the way forward, one of the things that's really, really important for us to be considering is that before we can find the way forward, we really need to get honest about who we've been. Right? About who we've been, about where we are in this social moment. As an institution, I'm here, faculty at UMass Amherst, and getting really clear on the social reality that we're situated within is going to be an important aspect of any possibility of moving forward. As somebody tweeted, there is no unity without accountability. A lot of the conversation that's happening in this social moment is about finding places for unity and healing, but not necessarily about the kind of accountability that needs to happen. And so that's very toxic, trying to move forward and live in harmony with anything where there is not that level of accountability. So I just want to start by just being very explicit about where we are, and then naming the fact that if we're going to talk about finding the way forward, we got to be honest about who we've been, which means that we got to be honest about this. We got to be honest that right here in our UMass community, there's complicity, deep complicity. Our educational systems remain complicit in the inequities that we're talking about. But specifically, as we talking about hitting home, I put the date here too. This is November 2018. And this is just one clip. But we know that this very overt and explicit act this was a result of a white supremacist group doing some things on campus. We see what happened at the Capitol, white supremacist group leading an insurrection. And then we believe that these are isolated moments or that these are extremists, but you better believe that systemically and permeating the reality of our institutions, these are the logics and the values that are with us, that are embedded in the very fabric of our nation, and by extension in the very fabric of our campus, of our classrooms, and for many within ourselves, right? And so what does that mean? Like, what does it mean to be honest about who we've been as a university? That conversation for me, this is less about the 5 steps to healing racism, because that's not a thing. And it's more about us becoming clear and confronting the lens, the perspectives, the ideologies that we each have, so that we can take up the true work of equity within our respective areas of influence. And so I did a talk not too long ago called Empathy is Not Equity. Because what's happening right now in this social moment, particularly when it comes to racial equity and justice, particularly when it comes to white people who are in the testimonial space of being about the work of equity, there's a lot of conversation about empathy. And I say institutional empathy as well, because a lot of our institutions are predominantly white institutions. We got sports franchises, we got people testifying about how empathetic we are about the situation of racial inequity. And the thing is that those testimonies, that naming, painting Black Lives Matter across the street, renaming streets, is not equity. Equity is transforming the material conditions of the most marginalized people in our society. It's very tangible and active. It's undoing, it's dismantling, it's abolishing the things that cause harm. And so I showed that very extreme example of what's happening on campus, just so that we don't like try to distance ourselves too much. We see ourselves as a very progressive campus, but just so we don't think we can distance ourselves too much from what happened at the Capitol, but then also to indicate that that is just a macrocosm of what's happening every day. And part of the reason why those conversations are not always as explicit as they need to be is because we also have severe racial disparities right here within our campus, right? And so institutional empathy, naming and feeling and grieving about the work of racial inequity is not transformation. It's not the work of equity. It's really going to be about getting down and doing the work. And so what I want to do is just show very quickly a framework that I use in my work as a scholar activist, as I work to build coalitions with communities, particularly Black, Indigenous, and communities of color, and with other institutions who are about this life. This fugitive action framework, which I really share in detail in my book, Black Appetite, White Food, is a way for us to understand how to do the work of equity, how to both become extremely explicitly, uncomfortably honest about who we are through deep analysis, and then take deep, tangible, palpable action against equity, so we could talk about finding that way forward. And so what it does is it invites us to look at both the systemic and individual aspects of what happens, because so in the example that I showed just a minute ago, what would happen often is we would say, you know, we all would look at something like that and say, what, there are white nationalists on campus that are talking about white supremacy and they're spewing racial hatred. We'll wag our finger at it. And that's something that happens more on this individual side. We'll see the interpersonal part of it, right? We'll see the dynamics play out, and it'll be polarizing and it'll be very obvious and hypervisual. But what we won't see is the systemic factors that allow for this to happen in the first place, and the other systemic factors that our institutions are embedded in that perpetuate white supremacy every day. And so the question is, how do we engage in deep, radical, honest, uncomfortable analysis of who we are, so we could talk about finding the way forward, so we could talk about real accountability and restoring trust, undoing harm, and so that we could really, with some integrity, talk about finding our way forward. It's this framework is the way that I want to introduce it to you. And this gives us an opportunity to look at the ideologies, the institutional factors, the interpersonal factors, and the internalized factors of any given situation. So for example, there's severe racial disparities at the UMass Amherst campus, right? And so instead of just looking at that, and a lot of times we're like, well, there's racism, but what do we do? That's the conversation we have. That analysis would come with us saying, okay, we have this particular problem. We need to look at this through the lens of what's happening ideologically. What ideologies that refers to our collective consciousness, our norms, our stereotypes. What ideologies function to exclude Black, Indigenous, and people of color from institutions of higher learning? What ideologies are at work that we're embedded in as an institution? And when we talk about the institutional level, so ideologies is something that you think like, oh, that's out there, that's not how we feel. What we know is that institutions, when you look at the institutional level, institutions testify of their ideologies. You'll see it in the racial disparities. You'll see it in the budget. You'll see it in the way, the retention or the lack thereof, right? And so what is our institution at the policy level, at the level of the numbers? What is our institution saying about where we stand in this landscape of racial equity and justice? How is that playing into the interpersonal dynamics that occur across campus? For example, what we saw, there's a lot of, if you talk to students of color on this campus, you will know that it is not easy. So those interpersonal realities are there. And then the internal landscape refers to how those interpersonal dynamics impact the internal level. You might see faculty of color just like rotating out of the institution and wonder, like, we're doing recruitment, why don't we have retention? Because what is happening interpersonally that people are internalizing, that it's embedded in the institutional values and practice, and that's a testimony of the ideologies. So this is just like a really quick, like I'm just going, but what I'm really trying to invite us into is developing lenses for analysis, that true radical analysis, so that we can invite and design the real action for moving forward with true accountability. And the last thing I'll say, because my time is up, is that as the co-director of the Center of Racial Justice and Youth Engaged Research, if you follow our work, if you follow me, I can share more and continue this conversation. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Jamila. That was fabulous. We can't expect some sort of little micro change when we are within a structure, an entire country, right? That is built on racism. Okay, so our next speaker is Trey Andrea. Welcome, Trey Andrea. Our question for you, for your focus, is how does the rise in white nationalism and overt racism affect your thinking about best strategies for promoting social justice?
So today I'm going to talk about a program that I think helps me answer that question. And, first I would say the short answer to that question, as Jamila so eloquently outlined for us just moments ago, the persistence of white supremacy is not new. We have to contend with the fact that it is not new, and that historically, even though we see different inflections of things now, there are well-documented ways in which this has been a problem and ingrained into the very fabric of all of our dominant institutions, including UMass, right? So that's the sort of short answer. And what goes along with that short answer is that, there are communities and there are entities on campus that have been striving to address some of these problems, whether or not we're always satisfied with those solutions. And I come from a humanities background. I'm an English professor. So my answers are kind of oriented in that vein. The longer answer that I think allows me to give maybe a slightly more nuanced response to how does the rise in white nationalism inform my work with in my teaching, in my research, and in community engagement. The longer answer, I think, is this. Again, coming from this humanities background in an English department, as an English professor who does very non-literary things, this is my answer. I would say that we have an urgent need for broad public humanities programs that combine critical thinking and analysis, which we're so good at in the humanities, with the cultivation of technical and civic literacies. So I'll give one example of what I mean by this and how it's playing out, and I'm still learning in this process. It's always ongoing to figure out what works best and what doesn't work best in community engaged work, especially. So I'll give one quick example of what I mean by this and what might be here for, I guess, the answer for how the humanities can be more involved in this moment, doing the kind of outreach that perhaps is not typically associated with, literary scholars, literary theorists, art historians. Not always, but some of us do in fact do a lot of this work. So my answer is that I established in 2016 the Radical Play Institute, which is a community after school program in Springfield that is geared toward high school and junior high school students who play video games, as that is one of my areas of research. So in this program, we try to develop 4 pillars of what I call radical play. That is self-consciousness, criticality, creativity, and then this ambition toward change, either making connections and kind of focusing on change in the community. So we try to get at, why do students like to play games? It's not just because it's fun. You know, kids think that I play games because I love games. That's true, but there's actually a lot that they can learn about themselves through their love of video games. We also develop a critical apparatus for how to understand games like Call of Duty, like Fortnite, fill in the blank of any game that you are aware of, people in your lives, maybe you play them also playing. So we develop that critical apparatus for being able to decode and understand the game worlds that are so pervasive these days. Creativity. We try to explore why are play and creativity so important, and how can digital media and what a lot of kids come to the program expressing their love for video games, how can that help them continue to express themselves in creative ways? And then again, there's this imperative for change, where we use games and game worlds, fictional digital worlds, to try to understand and imagine better options for society, for our local communities, and beyond. So using games as a way of kind of pointing forward. So that, in a nutshell, is an example of a public humanities program that I think tries to get at some of these things. It might not be obvious exactly how it's related to something like white supremacy, but don't worry, I'm getting there. Okay, so again, it involves direct outreach and engagement. So this is sort of the vision for what can a public humanities be. It also combines this work that we do around games with an ostensibly directly understood civic engagement, right? So thinking about our lives as citizens and people who have communities and people who have collective and individual needs. So it's kind of doing all of that work through and with games. But why video games, you might ask? Well, first, video games are consistently shaping culture. They're a part of culture, but they're continuing to shape culture and identities. At their worst, they can be adjacent to and directly connect to white supremacist ideologies and recruitment. They're often used as recruitment tools in this vein. It doesn't matter if you're Black, Latinx, Asian, white. Mainstream video games are a technical cultural apparatus that require our best analytical and deconstructive and remediation skills, right? Being able to decode and understand what's going on in the game worlds and how they convey various sorts of messaging. The medium is here to stay. So it's not my ambition to ever say that we shouldn't play games or that these games shouldn't necessarily exist. My ambition is to create a gaming public, and you have to realize that more than 60% of Americans report playing digital games daily. More than 60% of adults report playing games daily. That number is much higher for a younger demographic. So my goal is to help create a more critical and engaged population who are playing these games and who can capitalize on the transformative and productive power of play. So I'm going to explain this, what I just said, in another way using some other imagery. Okay, so this is an image of, in the background, Call of Duty. So it's a cutscene from a game, Call of Duty, which is fairly popular, so you may be aware it's a military shooter. And in the foreground, there is a picture of Donald Trump with Lil Wayne. Part of my work around video games is to help decode and understand these two things and how they're connected. Call of Duty, Donald Trump pardoning Lil Wayne. So in my work with younger communities, I try to help galvanize these communities who play games so that they can better understand this confluence of things. Why did Donald Trump pardon Lil Wayne, a rapper, and Kodiak Black, another rapper? Well, it's because, of course, Lil Wayne and other young Black celebrities have financial power, they have platforms, and at least to some extent, they have used their power to exploit inequities. And they also convey, in a number of ways, some inflections of toxic masculinity that are very familiar to the now former president. As such, they are ripe for being incorporated into this dangerous reactionary anti-Black base that connects the far right and white nationalism to young Black communities, right? Young Black communities and Latinx communities who play games, who have been throughout this last campaign receptive to some of this messaging. So the pardons are spectacles that can be used to insist that Trump who has used his power directly to oppress and to create policies that oppress, is not racist because he can be down with a couple of individual Black folk, right? So that's some of the work and some of the conversations that I like to have around gameplay and a game like Call of Duty, which is imperialistic for sure, and which just promotes a kind of violence that requires some very sort of dedicated decoding and unnerving, right? And has some of the same values right at the surface of a text in a genre like that. So in my world, Lil Wayne and Call of Duty matter in terms of symbols and powers, in terms of tribes and community and meaning making. These are representational spaces that actually mirror our world of mirrored simulations and fake news. So we need a republic, we need a demographic that is more savvy at being able to understand how these things play out in the digital realm. From the theories of Jean Baudrillard, who warned us of these dangerous hyperrealities, to Octavia Butler, who's an author who shows us ways forward, this humanity-centered education that is public and can be public and made more publicly available can teach us, can teach these savvy, critical readings, new and old ways to dismantle, decode, and deprogram. In my experience, we have a sense of urgency. The moment that we're living now kind of sort of escalates and creates this sort of more visible sense of urgency around needing to do this work in a variety of communities. And in my case, I happen to work mostly with junior high and high school students of color. But I am going to argue that we need to scale up the public humanities initiatives to address other communities who would go beyond the groups that I've worked with. I also want to say, just kind of as an aside, as somebody who researches video games, I play a lot of video games. And nothing about me as a sort of Black, queer, progressive academic says that I would be receptive to advertising that supports the far right and Donald Trump. Yet, the more I play video games, the more platforms like YouTube and Google push white supremacist ideology directly to me. When again, everything in my demographic, everything in my digital profile counters that. So there's some very sort of powerful and fast connection between the kinds of digital play and media reception that somebody who plays video games might be receptive to, and these types of white supremacist ideologies, right? So you can only imagine how other people who are not me, people from other subjectivities who happen to play video games, are receiving and interacting with the stream of direct marketing that will come their way simply because they play video games, right? So that's kind of another aside about the connection between white supremacist ideologies and these sort of leisure and play spaces that we might not otherwise take seriously. So my work in the public humanities kind of does this, is focused here. It's a small sort of slice of what I think is possible and what I've been encouraged by since 2016 in running a variety of programs related to this. But I do think that there's a need, a grave need, to scale up the public humanities in other ways that go beyond what I've imagined here. We have an urgent need for creating civic pods, if you will, community engagement programs and projects that are progressively civically minded. We need innovative work that links this humanities, these critical thinking and reading and writing skills, with these other types of literacies, technical and civic, primarily in this moment. But we need to cater to other communities, working class communities, other Black, Latinx, Asian American communities, working class white communities, and even the communities that are so enamored with fake news and alternative facts. That's not necessarily the kind of work that I'm most suited to do, but we need a public education that directly tries to work with and reach those communities. We need a sort of grassroots approach in this regard. Why are Americans so afraid of socialism? Do we understand as a public what socialism is? What is social democracy? There are gaps in the public knowledge that I think the university, folks who work at the university in general, has an imperative to address. How else are people going to counter these other logics, these other ways of sense making, right? The misperception and misunderstanding of so many things that relate to our public, private, and civic lives. So what I'm advocating is a scaled up public humanities that can do some of this work, and of course connect with folks in the social sciences, in education, or in the STEM fields across the campus to create and support existing and new programming that can work deliberately in this regard, in the civic, the technological, and the technological and the sort of critical and creative realm. So as an English professor, again, who does non-literary things, I know we're supposed to talk about our reading recommendations, so I put mine here up front. I recommend Octavia Butler's The Parable of the Sower, which and The Parable of the Talents is a sequel to this book. But there's a graphic novel version, and there's also a novel version. You can choose whichever you prefer. And it is a dystopian novel, and yes, we are living in a dystopia. But what I also find instructive, and what so many current social activists and organizers have found encouraging in speculative fiction and in science fiction, is this focus on what might be possible beyond the dystopia and through the dystopia. So another way of thinking about this in my work and in my outreach is speculative game design, where I have students work on creating and imagining new worlds and new structures, new social interactions. The sky's the limit. Their imaginations are often bolder and better than mine, right? They teach me a lot about what's possible and what can be. And the idea behind this is that to create and play better games, we have to be able to imagine those better games and those better game worlds. But of course, that extends to our lived and real experiences outside of the fictional realm as well. I'm also going to leave us with one term. You know, it wouldn't be a sort of good presentation from the non-literary English professor if I didn't introduce a term called the critical utopia. Right. So as I said, Octavia Butler's work is coming from the dystopian tradition, but there's something called a critical dystopia, and the sort of inverse of that is the critical utopia, which does that work of showing us what's wrong, of identifying the problems, of identifying the histories, of identifying the inequities, of taking that honest assessment, and also showing us ways forward and through. So from the literary tradition, the literary sort of scholarship and theory, we can think of the critical utopia and utopia not as the perfect world. Utopia gets a bad rap in this sense, right? Where we want to think that, oh, it's perfection. You're never going to reach perfection. Utopia is not exactly that, thought about in this way. The critical utopia, Tom Moylan is a literary theorist, argues that utopia expresses and explores what is desired under certain conditions. And it also contains the hope that these desires may be met in reality rather than merely in fantasy. So in this tradition of writing and thinking, there is a way to, like Octavia Butler does, actually craft out that agenda, actually show how you can move forward. It's a way. Utopia is a way about identifying and addressing our unmet desires. And in this moment, we have a lot of them, right? Racial justice, food equity, ecological concerns. There's a lot of damage. The pandemic raging on and on. Over 400,000 people have died in the United States from this and more. So we can identify those needs, and the critical utopia, that imperative of the critical utopia, calls for a bold, a radical, and a hopeful sort of reimagining of what can be. It's not unpaired with action. Action and organization matter as well, as I think a sort of scaled up public humanities can embrace. But we have to be able to dream and imagine and construct those spaces as we do that other work. So that's my contribution for today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Treyandra. We really appreciate that. Michael, how do you think about systemic racism? And in the context of this discussion, can you offer your thoughts on a way forward?
Well, thank you, Kathleen. And The earlier panelists have done a remarkable job of really outlining sort of the urgency of the day and where we are. I'll make a couple of comments and then I'll move to a little bit of more structured discussion. But as I think about dropping an anchor, and I mean that in terms of sort of the intellectual aspect, as well as sort of the internalization aspect, that anchor that I would drop would be, we as a country have not confronted the intentional willingness to reject humanity to preserve white supremacy. And so when you think about that broadly, you say, well, we kind of know that. But the reality is that when we think about humanity and we think about whether or not everyone is viewed as actually human and valuable as a human on this earth, then it drifts away pretty quickly because, frankly, we've seen over hundreds of years a willingness to reject this humanity to preserve white supremacy. I'll give three examples. Obviously, slavery is sort of the nexus of how we think about the dehumanizing aspect of people of color and Africans brought here to build the country and the economic base. But then every generation has had to face the challenge and the battle that we see ourselves in now. These are dangerous times, but Black people, people of color, and Indigenous people have lived in dangerous times in this country since its beginning. So when I look at moving from the slavery aspect that overhangs everything, we're able to reject the humanity in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921, where a white mob burned and destroyed an entire section. We believe upwards of 300 people were murdered. The infrastructure of protecting white supremacy went so far as to actually rip out the front pages of the newspapers, and the lessons were never taught, and they acted as though it never happened. So that moves us then to Emmett Till in 1955, where a white mob, ostensibly for a very similar reason, by the way, decided that they were going to lynch, beat, and drown a 14-year-old Black boy. And that brings us then to the extrajudicial murder of George Floyd last year. There's no other way to describe it. And so what we're able to do and what the world saw was the lack of humanity in dealing with that circumstance. And through history, I think that is the confrontation that needs to occur. As long as one group of people does not view the other as human, it justifies any behavior, any action, and there's no expectation of accountability. So I leave that as an anchor. I've got one chart. I'll go through it pretty quickly because we're a little late on time. I think that's going to come up now. Let me just clear this chart for a moment. And by the way, I have to give a lot of credit to raceforward.org, who's done a lot of research and really bucketized these four areas. And my intent was really to go through and describe the interconnectedness of each one of these buckets, because we're dealing with systemic racism, which is really built on behaviors, policies that get enshrined in laws. And so, although we're very happy of the new administration implementing executive orders, we need a systemic remedy, because each one of these issues confronting Black, brown, poor, Indigenous, Latina populations here, non-white populations in this country suffer through this interconnectedness. And so the central puzzle piece here is a strategy of integrated policies. And so the whole notion there is that if we're talking about a wealth gap, that is intentional. That is not accidental, that there is one. Employment, employment rates are not the real measure in terms of unemployment or employment, because relative to the wealth gap, what types of employment do people of color engage in? We saw this explode with the pandemic. The economic engine for underrepresented folks in this country came from the service economy, retail economy. The notion here that you can't do that with Zoom from home. And those jobs so disappeared and went away and may never come back because of technology. Housing discrimination, obviously the fastest way to grow wealth in this country is to own property. The hurdles are huge, very large, and systemic and being maintained. And of course, education equity, absolutely where you live, what zip code you live in determines your quality of life, your opportunities that present themselves in the future, your healthcare options, and obviously education. And local property tax codes enshrine this consistent discrimination against delivering equitable education. I'm kind of looking at the clock here, but my point, if I move to incarceration, the notion that Black and brown people are more likely to be arrested and serve jail time for nonviolent crimes than their white counterparts. They're more likely to spend more time incarcerated. They are more likely to be in jail waiting for a hearing before they even get an opportunity to present their case, and more likely to be required to deliver a cash bail instead of, as we saw, people who are involved in domestic terrorism being released to their mom. On the healthcare side, obviously tied to these three things as well, because child poverty is a critical element here today in infant mortality. So we still have a situation in this country where a Black or brown infant is 2.5 times more likely not to make their first birthday. So expanded access has more to do with meeting the community where they are, delivering healthcare services where they are, where they work, where they live, and in cases where they are incarcerated, that as well. And then cultural competence. So the very notion that representation is extremely important. So, people of color have every good reason not to have a lot of confidence and faith and trust in the healthcare system. That has a compounding effect on the negative health of these communities, and obviously not dealing with mental health. If you look at all the other burdens that are put on these communities, mental health is obviously going to be a significant issue. Immigration policy, well, we know government surveillance exists. We also know that immigration arrest, very similar to the incarceration discussion, and also the notion that we have people coming here who are really seeking asylum from terrorism, from death threats, and not allowed to come here, but seems to only apply on the southern border for brown people coming from Central and South America. We have undocumented immigrants coming into the United States every day from other parts of the world. So I was going to spend a longer time going through all that, but I kind of raced through it, and appreciate you listening.
Hey, thank you so much, Michael. We very much appreciate your wise words. So we are at 8 o'clock, but if you guys are willing to stick around, we can answer a few questions. Does that sound good? And obviously anybody can cut out whenever they need to, but I wanted to take a minute very quickly to just say something that I don't know if a lot of people, outside Indigenous communities really think about, but all of the people who are part of a marginalized group, be it, African-American, Indigenous, Latinx, whatever it happens to be, we have been divided by structures in the foundation of this country to the point that we hardly even can look at each other and see the similarities that we have. The truth of the matter is, a few years ago, people were talking about we're the 99%. We're the 99%. Who would want to divide us up and have us attacking each other and not really getting it and not really understanding each other? The 1%. So if anybody has like 4 hours for me to explain it, I could actually talk about the connection between there being a 1% and every societal ill in this country. But one similarity, for example, is George Floyd was killed by Minneapolis police officers. Well, a lot of my family live on reservations in Minnesota. And believe me, going to Minneapolis has always been a dangerous thing. For my 16th birthday, Minneapolis police officers beat my cousin into a coma. Threw him in a jail cell, and then took him to an emergency room entrance where they opened a police car door and rolled him out on the ground to die. He had 200 stitches and a near-death experience later. He's still alive. One of my great uncles, the Klan tried to lynch him, so I've been called the N-word. And so we've got so much in common, but who doesn't want us to see eye to eye? Who doesn't want us to really get it and to make us feel like, or make society generally feel like it's our fault? The American dream is there if you just work hard enough. So if you don't achieve it, you're lazy, because it's there, right? Is it really there? No. Kids are told you've got to go to college, but then they're told we don't have money for that, right? We did get questions about UMass and can we make it affordable for students who don't have that kind of money? Well, students are being told to take out student loans. We don't have money for education because we're putting all our money into prisons to lock up Black and brown people. Let's look at the history of when these changes happened. So we did have a lot of questions. I want to answer one really quickly. Somebody asked the last case that I discussed, Worcester v. Georgia. Trey Andrea, someone wanted to know, and I'm sorry, I'm not mentioning names here, I just have the questions in my head, but someone wanted to know if QAnon was perhaps involved in kind of brainwashing or recruiting through gaming.
Yes, absolutely. Gaming platforms like Discord were used, they were from its inception to have candid conversations outside of like Xbox Live and PlayStation servers about just people were discussing their plans for where they would meet up, what they would do. Games have long been a recruitment tool for any number of things, from the military. They're used in military recruitment all the time, but they've definitely been used in these white supremacist extremist groups recruitment as well. And someone else sort of related to that asked, what would a healthy gaming culture look like? A healthy gaming culture is going to reflect what we have here. Games cannot do and reflect anything better than consistently as a whole, gaming culture as a whole, better than what the context in which they were made is going to reflect. So yes, you can have games that are progressive. There are games that are much more non-literal, games that are like kind of queer, games that are subversive. These are not mainstream games, but mainstream games, like other mainstream forms of media, are going to tend to reflect the ideological base in which they were made. So how do you change that? You change that through changing the structure outside of games, and you change that through things like improving STEM education and who makes games, who has the educational access to be the game designers that are publishing and creating games on a large scale. And in the meantime, you have to help educate and help inform folks and help teach folks how to critically navigate the game worlds that they're constantly in, from Candy Crush to your biggest blockbuster game. The free-to-play games are also extremely suspect.
Okay, thank you, Trey Andrea. So like I said, we have several questions here that really anyone can answer, I suppose, from different perspectives. But one person had a question specifically for Michael. Can you talk about some of the things that you are doing to combat some of the issues that you discussed?
Sure, I'll highlight the foundation, which we run, but specifically the partnership that we've established with UMass and the Massenburg Institute, which is a 2-week summer in residence program for rising 10th graders from Massachusetts and New Jersey, underrepresented minority students who actually come to campus and they complete a very rigorous curriculum offered through the Computer Science and Information Systems department, as well as School of Engineering, applied research. And so the notion here is twofold. One, the students that we bring to campus, most have never left home. They certainly have never been on a college campus. And the way that it's structured is that they actually apply to UMass, so they're in the Spire system. And so they're getting some subtle education and grooming as they're going through the process of just being part of this program. And from there, they're able to be more knowledgeable and frankly, be a little bit more aggressive in designing the curriculum that they'll need to be successful in earning a STEM degree as they think about moving to college. You know, today, unfortunately, 6 out of 10 underrepresented minority students who show up on a college campus in this country with the desire to earn a STEM degree never matriculate with a STEM degree. So just from the standpoint of impacting our competitiveness on a global basis, we are really sort of, if you want to think about it this way, we are really cutting off our nose to spite our face because we fall back on this idea of not supporting all of our communities as we should. And so that work is something that we feel good about because it's actionable. We're implementing it in multiple high schools. These students are getting real benefit, and we're getting great feedback from the parents, from these students, and from the students themselves. Just anecdotally, they will comment that it's amazing that we bring them together because they thought that they were sort of the only nerds around. And then they find out that there's an entire cohort participating in a program like this, and they become lifelong friends.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Michael. So I think that one suggestion that I would like to make is that I know, we all have pretty empty inboxes, right? So perhaps if people wanted to contact us, if they have any questions or want even more reading suggestions than we provided earlier, there's so much to read, there's so much to do. And I don't know, I mean, a lot of people are very, very concerned about the role that UMass has in making sure that, we move forward in a more positive way. We had a rough 4 years. We are probably putting a little too much on the Biden administration right now, but I am sort of liking his really quick and drastic moves, and the fact that he mentions Indigenous people. I mean, my entire life, I never heard Indigenous in the list of marginalized peoples, but it's something that is absolutely fixable. We are not born racist. We are not born hating people who look different. We are not born, hating people who have a different skin color. And I know that might sound very, preschool simplistic, but that's the truth of the matter. We are taught this, and then it's enforced in the structures that hold up our society. And that's what we have to break down. It's going to take more than just, a 2-hour lesson on recognizing your own racism or something along those lines. It's much, much, much bigger than that. So, Michael, did you have any parting comments?
Well, I guess the, you mentioned that people are not taught. I'll reflect back to this anchor that I dropped. Anecdotally, 2 buddies and I are walking down the sidewalk in Boston back in the mid-'80s. We had left our respective jobs, wearing suits and ties and walking down one of the main thoroughfares, and encountered a homeless white woman pushing a carriage, cans, bottles, all kinds of other stuff she had collected along the way. And as we passed, she muttered the N-word.
Oh,
And so I turned, and my other two buddies said, "Oh, let it go." But what stuck with me was that was all she had left.
my God. Yeah.
So I think that the whole idea of when you say why and how, understanding that this is something that is real and it is designed to perpetuate and preserve this notion of white supremacy. It is core to what's required for those who don't have a big enough brain and heart to understand that we're all on this planet together. Nobody gets off alive.
Yeah. We have the caste system reinforced constantly in this country, whether it's, she's prettier than me, or he has bigger muscles than you, or whatever it happens to be, your religion, your skin color, your country of origin. We are constantly pitted against each other. And that's a really, great distraction from the people that we really are up against, the people who, really do control the country a lot more than we do. And, we have to stop fighting each other. I could speak for about 5 hours on how the US government pits tribes against each other, individual, Indian tribes against each other. It's really quite amazing. But, I do want, to encourage anyone to just reach out to us if you have any questions. There are so many books to read. There's so many, ways that we could take this topic. And I'm sure there will be more discussions going forward. I don't want to see the need for talking about racism come up only when there's a insurrection at the Capitol. It shouldn't take that. There are things happening every single day in every single town in this country, and we have to talk constantly. But I do feel like mainly the structures that are in place, the violent structures that are in place, cultural violence, structural violence, definitional violence, are maybe where we need to start looking now. So bye, Michael. Okay, I think that's it. We are signing off. And thank you all so much for attending, and we hope to see you again. I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions that we wanted to get to. Thank you.